Our story begins with the gates. Let us enter with Donges by the Lion Gates. Gardens and chasms in Donges Bay, as the plaque says. They are some distance south of the entrance to South Fairy Chasm on land then owned by Donges and Musinger, and welcome all to the area. Other gates have been built at the entrance to South Fairy Chasm itself. How open the landscape was in the early days. Look at the gates today. North Fairy Chasm is on its third set of stone gates. The gates have been a gathering place for kids and for Dorothy Logeman and friends to dance. Some people had private gates to their summer idols. Fairy Chasm was where the upper 3rd Street merchants came on weekends in the summer in their horse and buggies. To the lake, to beautiful Donges Bay. The Indians had been drawn to it in the past. Now came Jake Donges and his friends. Then and now. The lake bluff was a place to sit and look. Even then it had erosion. Splitting the chasm in half was Fish Creek, though earlier it had been called Pine Creek. Joining north and south were the bridges near the mouth of the creek. The first of 3 bridges in about the same location was built in 1910. The third in 1935. Some young rascals by the names of Warren Foy, the Logeman boys, and Tom Cubb helped wreck the last one in about 1945. There were other bridges along the woodland paths in the ravine, now long gone and forgotten. And then there was the dam. The first section was built in 1908, and it was added to in the next 2 or 3 years. It provided a place to sit and have your picture taken. There was a place to swim. And at one point it was said to be almost 1,000 feet wide. There were places to just sit and relax along the quiet private lake above the dam. And finally, in 1923, the foundation gave way and the dam cracked. Because what remained was considered dangerous, dynamite was used in 1933 to reduce it to rubble. Unfortunately, no one told the dynamiter about the railroad rails holding it together. Even dynamite couldn't finish the job, so we still have our picturesque ruin.
There were many paths through the woods and down to the lake. And there were spring work crews. Perhaps Fred Foy should ask his work crews today to wear a hat and vest. From pictures and letters and Fish Creek Park Company minutes, we know that the woods have always been a very special part of life in the chasm. There were signs carrying German poetry. There were opportunities for flower gathering, but don't look, we think they're gathering trillium. There were places for poetry reading and for picnics. The lake and the woods, Fairy Chasm's natural treasures.
The early residents made certain they had the makings for fun, regardless of the season. On the north side of the ravine, just west of the present path to the lake, there was the pavilion, built sometime before 1915. It was the place to be on Saturday nights in the summer. The kids were sent home at 9 p.m., and the adults danced until the oil lamps gave out or the accordion player wore out his fingers. And oh yes, there was beer. The pavilion was torn down in the 1930s. But the gemütlichkeit remains in the chasm. Although many were summer residents, there were enough staying year-round to keep the social wheel well-oiled. When good times lagged, Jake Donges would fire up the neighborhood with a nightshirt raid. Dressed in his nightshirt and lantern in hand, he would rouse the first neighbor, perhaps Conrad Blommer. Together, similarly dressed, they would proceed to Jaeger's, and on, and the whole procession might end up at Usinger's for a bit of liquid refreshment. We start our calendar of activities and good times when the chilling winds of Thanksgiving herald in the Christmas and New Year celebrations. In the early days, as now, neighborhood parties, cookie exchanges, and caroling bring us together. Winter provides a resort-like setting for participating in winter activity. Sleigh riding. Cross-country skiing and ice skating. And for the more adventurous, there was the toboggan run. Sledding down the beach path and climbing on ice formations on the shore. There was a time when children and fathers relished the snowstorms that made traveling into town impossible and school unattendable.
Predictably, the long-awaited spring would return, and again our woods were full of rare and beautiful flowers and birds. Botanists and students came to study our isolated treasures of nature. The spring also brings the running of the smelt and the unwelcome and pungent-smelling alewives. But it is summer that we all long for if winter in the chasm is magical and spring is mystical, then summer is most definitely majestic. It was the time summer residents opened their cottages and families headed for the beach. Mothers would hurry through their household chores in order to spend the day with their children and friends at the beach. Often we would find Betty Runft, Ginny Kelly, and Gert Roots in the water, regardless of water or air temperatures. In the 60s, a group of our teens would swim point to point with Ray Staling riding safety in his boat. Today we still find swimmers, canoers, and an occasional windsurfer. Summer was also the setting for major social events, especially the annual 4th of July celebration. Both North and South Chasms continue to hold patriotic parades and picnics. There was a time when a baseball game of provincial rivalry between the two neighborhoods was played in Ann Howard's backyard, and a fireworks display was enjoyed at the beach. The North Chasm still enjoys a game of baseball in Annie's yard, but now it is the youngsters versus the seniors. In recent years, the North Chasm has added another delightful tradition to its annual 4th of July picnic. Entertainment by our own Fairy Chasm Philharmonic, which includes the young and not so young alike. The South Chasm also has their own resident musical group which leads the annual July 4th parade, a tradition begun with the late Gene Coles. It was Gene who provided the music for the raucous parties in the pavilion years earlier. The summer schedule winds down with our annual Labor Day corn roast at the beach, when summer is officially ushered out and children and parents prepare for the new school year. Such is the typical Fairy Chasm social year. It is in the spirit of our earlier residents and their passion for nature and community that we carry on today, and hopefully for many years to come. Not everything in the chasm was romantic, playful, or harmonious. Our environs have not been immune to destructive forces. We need think only of the catastrophic failure of the dam as it is seen here at the very beginning of a major spring flood. Here is one of the many fine boathouses on the private reservoir behind the dam, left useless and abandoned to rot after the lake disappeared within minutes when the dam broke. Great storms and surf have buffeted the Donges family, note the trumpet in hand, wrecked ships in our bay, and wrought havoc on our lake bluffs. Well-constructed boathouses and breakwaters have been no match for the lake's winter fury. The first modern boathouse was built by the Stalings in 1958. Note the innovative tramway ascending the lake bluff to the right of the boathouse. The Foys, Robinsons, and Risingers soon followed suit, but their structures were destroyed by ice and water in the winter of 1969 and 70. Art Rumpt collected some of the remnant flotsam to build a new boathouse which, along with the Stalings, now the Burgers, are the only two remaining today. Although this scene may look serene, this picnic is but 5 feet from the bluff, and the entire home behind is the only chasm home to be jacked up and moved further inland. And then there was the great suspended stairway on the south side, designed and built by a committee of resident engineers, lasting a full 18 months before its ignominious demise. The devastating Dutch elm disease claimed over 400 graceful cathedral columns. Torrential spring rains continued to cause major landslides on the ravine slopes, not to mention the strange responses from trees which rerouted upside down. Massive snowstorms have buried cars, and here we see Bibi Lindsay after an arduous shoveling. Notice the additional 10 inches of snow which has accumulated on her hat while husband Bud was adjusting the camera. The most recent destruction, perhaps the most widespread and long-lasting, is coming from our own dear friends. Their exploding numbers in the chasm, here illustrated by a doe with her 3, instead of the usual 1 or 2 fawns, are consuming entire vegetable gardens, ornamental shrubs and plants, restored prairie flowers, our ancient trilliums, and most every sapling of our 2 most graceful indigenous tree species, the white pine and the white birch. In another 100 years, there may be none of these beautiful trees left. Lastly, but far from least, there was, of course, the great asteroid shower of 1964.
From small and humble, sometimes homemade, sultry summer cottages and simple, joyous country living to commodious, year-round homesteads with modern conveniences, utilities, Cuisinarts, and suburban splendors. The magic of the gardens and chasms of Fish Creek has often inspired a special relationship between homeowners and homesteads in a unique area on Donges Bay. Deep roots of heartfelt attachment to one's land and home have been particularly common in this realm now called Fairy Chasm. Our founder, Jake F. Donges, in 1873, when only 13 years old, first hiked out to our bay and later drove a horse and buggy for hours to reach his dreamland. In later years, had he been able to fly overhead, he would have seen his visions recreated many times over. Jake Donges, a Milwaukee entrepreneur who founded the still extant Donges Hats and Gloves, along with his energetic wife Alma and their 2 daughters, rejoiced in their newfound summer retreat. Note the trumpet under Jake's arm and his trumpet playing on the bluff. The transformations in architecture and lifestyle from 1892 to 1992 have been, in Thoreau's words, more miraculous than whimsical. Many of our ancestors and neighbors have devoted themselves in love and labor to creating a family, a home, and a community in accordance with their ideals. The romance and vision of Jake Donges, along with his partner Fred Usinger, set the tone for a century of respect and creativity towards one's immediate environment. Here is the Usinger Estate home with its flagpole, cannon, and separate kitchen pavilion on the right. Fred is seen here on the left, standing alone in front of the house. Down on our beach, with tents and bandstand in the background, Fred Usinger and Cavalry Troop A practiced their maneuvers. Later, the U.S. Army patrolled the woods, preparing for World War I, forerunners of the current security officers on the north side. The Donges' first cottage, called the Shady Nook, was possibly the first home in what was later to become Bayside. Here in front of that cottage is the Usinger family on holiday weekend. Riding in the pony wagon is the father of Frederick Usinger III. And here is the cottage today, fully remodeled by the Maxons. Finally, Jake built his grand estate home with numerous cellars, tunnels, and a cliffside room for viewing Lake Michigan. Its entry was beneath this pergola. Jake's romanticism knew no bounds as he adorned the area with statues, large and small. A caretaker's cottage, a log cabin, was soon built in South Fairy Chasm, shown here hidden behind the maple tree in the upper right, next to the stately Blummer Cottage, of Blummer's chocolate fame, at top center. Incidentally, this is the first known photo of a South Side July 4th parade. The Blummer Cottage remained prominent until it was destroyed to make way for this new suburban home, top center, now owned by the Brucheys. Next to the Blummers was the original and still standing barn, which sheltered horses, a cow, pigs, chickens, and a crank-start touring car. The community circle in front of the barn was then a garden. The Gobble home was built and expanded. Note the water tower at bottom center, used to hold water pumped up from Fish Creek itself. This duplex, later occupied by the Schranks, Coles, Watsons, and Moreaus, is the only residence still owned and lived in by a third and fourth generation family, Ted and Lynn Moreau and their children. On the next lot, Adolph Lowy and his father built this home. Notice the outline of a tennis court in the foreground. They were the forefathers of the only five-generation family still living in the chasm, the third-generation Lowys and the fourth and fifth generation Branzers. Here is that homestead as it is today, thoroughly modernized and owned by the Londons. Adolph Lowy's brother Louis also built a lakeside cottage, shown here being dismantled, with permission, by a local resident scavenging lumber for his own remodeling. On the left here, next to the quickly disappearing Louis Lowy cottage, is the Jaeger of bakery fame home, eventually to be brilliantly rebuilt by the Hensons. Then and now, the Schoofs, who daily netted fish on Donges Bay for commercial sale, built this home, seen here as it is today, nearly unchanged, owned by Nancy Cordero. This home had the first radio in the chasm. The Staling Company cottage was built in 1913 and is now owned by Pat Blummer in its elegant restoration. The last cottage on Lake Drive, built by the Gerhards and called Pine Point, was expanded several times to accommodate ever more grandchildren. When the chaos became too great, the senior Gerhards built this separate sleeping cottage called the Second Honeymoon House. It is now the only unrestored living quarters from that era yet standing in the chasm. Inside is this personal signature, built by William Gerhard and G.A. Watson, June 27, 1920. The property was eventually sold to Slack Ulrich, who tore down the main cottage, burned the rubble, resulting in a late-night fire brigade visit, gouged the earth, pondered his blueprint dreams with the Masons, and directed dutiful family inspections. Much later, with his completed home in the background, he sold an extra acre upon which soon appeared the foundation of the Lindsay, now Lewis, home. One of the first Lake Bluff cottages, built by the Trettines, was painstakingly remodeled and handcrafted, masonry and all, in the 1950s by William Wills. A generation later, after extreme interior damage from broken steam pipes, came the carefully planned conflagration of 1991, during which 6 community fire departments practiced their skills. The new Xander Cronkite home, the newest in the chasm, arose from its ashes. In the North Chasm, the first house that we know of was built in 1829, long before Donges was born. It became known as the Caretaker's Home, later refurbished, now owned by the Nielsen's. After the Fish Creek Park Company was formed, approximately 20 dwellings were constructed as summer cottages. Looking north, we see what is now the Sheldons, Hollanders, Jensvolds, and Hilts. The cottage built by Hugo Zedler is now the Caseys. Here's the red brick house built by Judge Elsner, past and present. The first year-round home was built by Audemars Logeman in 1928. During Prohibition, the Zetnig home had a still in a secret room in the basement under the garage. This most likely supplied the pavilion parties, and many others, with alcohol. The home is now owned by the Branzers. Around 1950, the Nelsons built the last purely summer cottage, now the Lemkes. In the decade of the 50s, almost 25% of today's homes, such as the Princes, were constructed. Several of the summer cottages were demolished, and new homes were built in their place, like the Granzos, and later the Bilgos. Most of the others, like the Hilts, remodeled theirs into year-round homes. In all of this rich history of Fairy Chasm, the visions and soul of our original Indian inhabitants and of Jake Donges have been rejuvenated many times over. The legacy of appreciation of both nature and community is a precious gift to pass along to our children and grandchildren.